Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Well, good morning and welcome to our Blog Talk Radio. This is Lisa Winton from Institute for Personal Development. And with me is Kenny Toy, otherwise known as Swami Jayananda, founder of Institute for Personal Development. Good morning, Swami. How are you today?
Good. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Well, last week we talked about, on our session, what is yoga? And so this week's topic, we are going to discuss what does it look like when I'm doing yoga? Why don't you start us off with maybe some pitfalls or obstacles that a person may have in attaining enlightenment?
Well, according to the Yoga Sutras, there are basically four major obstructions to enlightenment. They are fear, ignorance, laziness, and selfishness. But I think probably the biggest barrier to the true experience of yoga is recognizing we come in attached to a source of sustenance that is limiting. And what we have to do is to separate from one source of sustenance and reconnect to something different. That is probably the biggest problem with regard to, am I really doing yoga? Because that's what we talked about last week. Yoga is the union of the individual with the divine. So when you cross-examine these four basic obstructions, fear, ignorance, laziness, selfishness, the one-size-fits-all solution to these barriers or obstacles is what they called brahmacharya, carrier of Brahman. It is our connection to this secret source of sustenance that enables us to overcome these obstacles. It is this source of sustenance that makes a human being become something different. That's what we talked a little bit about last week, this thing called apotheosis, this process of the human becoming divine. But some of the misconceptions in the yoga community are you don't have to separate. All you have to do is just start the practice. If that becomes your mode of operation, then what you're actually doing is you're contributing to the problem. And that's what I think is very different about the Kriya Yoga we teach at Institute for Personal Development. We don't just start trying to get our foot to our head and then think that this is making me closer to this thing called God. We recognize there's preparatory work. That's why our program is a path of action, it's a path of knowledge, and it's a path of devotion. And it's not one or the other. It's not, well, my path is a path of knowledge. You need them all. And they work together. And a big part of it is coordinating it, but also understanding what is this designed to do? What does it look like when the individual is united with the divine? Because again, it's just a string of words. It's language. But if you don't understand the intention of the original instruction, then the whole thing can fall apart. The Tibetans had a wonderful saying, you need the finger to point to the moon, but it is woe unto them who mistaken the finger for the moon. For you shall never understand the bright light of the moon, nor what the finger is. So a big part of interpreting union of the individual with the divine is you have to understand what is the divine aspect of the human experience. You don't just start putting paint on a wall. Say, for example, if you're going to paint a room, it's not, I'm just going to start putting some paint up on the wall. There's always preparatory work that must be in place, because if there's grease or oil or any kind of substance on that wall that paint is not compatible with, then it's not going to stick. And the same with your yoga practice. If you don't understand the deep intention of it, then what you're basically doing is you are putting all your efforts in attaching yourself to a resource of energy that is going to actually keep you in this very limited perspective. It will actually become part of your demise as opposed to contribute to your success. Because without separating from that one source of sustenance and reconnecting to this other source of sustenance, we stay attached to the source of sustenance that is problematic. Probably one of the best ways I've ever had to understand that, I think, is even like in religion. We talked a little bit about that. Today we are not religious, but we're spiritual. We think religion is something we don't need anymore. We've outgrown that. But the word religion means to relink. The origins of religion was the same thing as the origins of yoga, was to help a human being unite with a source of sustenance, with this dimension of your reality, made us become something different. And so even in religious communities, there's statements like, sex out of marriage is immoral. And of course, what does that mean? Because the word marriage is a religious term. The marriage is really the union of the individual with the divine. So to try and take the physical union of two human beings together without this deeper inner marriage, there's nothing intrinsically evil with it, but it doesn't do what it was intended to do. Kind of like we talked a little bit about this, I think, last week, trying to use a snowblower without gasoline, putting water in the snowblower and then going out and trying to clear the driveway becomes a Herculean task. Because we know the snowblower, when it has gasoline in it and the combustion engine is doing what it's supposed to do, then clearing the driveway is a very different experience than when you're trying to push the snowblower around with snow without starting it up. And I think the same is true with human beings. It's like we're trying to get the physical union without this deeper union with your divinity, but we don't know what it's like or what it's supposed to look like when we're actually doing this. So what you have to basically do is go back to the texts, and you have to read them and look at, because this union with the divine, this secret source of sustenance, makes us become something different. And it makes all of the original rules and regulations that have deteriorated into conduct possible. Humans in this adult state, humans, when they have this internal connection, are virtuous by nature. It's not something that you're trying to do. And so a big part of how do I know I'm really doing yoga is, what source of sustenance am I drawing from? Am I drawing from the outside world, fear and limitation? Am I drawing from particles and waves, duality? Or am I drawing from this indivisible, unified state? And if you don't have the preparatory work in place, then nothing really is going to happen.
Where would a person start in their preparatory work? What would be the first thing that they should try to accomplish?
Well, probably the easiest way is to just, rather than reinvent the wheel, go to your yamas, your 8 essential stages of yoga, yamas and niyamas. Most people start with asana, but asana without, like I was saying, without brahmacharya, you don't have this internal connection. You don't have this attachment to this more reliable resource of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So just to stay with the original format, you want to research the yamas and the niyamas. Like we said last week, the one that is of the utmost importance is this one called brahmacharya, carrier of Brahman, because that will tie you into this secret to life. This concept of putting God first is a central theme for all of the texts we read. And again, coming back to the language, what does that look like when I'm doing it? The concept in Kriya Yoga is thinking right, knowing the difference between a need and a want. And then, of course, knowing what your needs are in their order of importance. Because in reality, even though there are many paths, there really is only one yoga. There's only one truth, there's only one God, only one number one need. And if your path isn't leading to this, then you are experiencing what they call in the Yoga Sutras avidya, ignorance. And ignorance is mistaking the impermanent for the permanent.
Okay.
The Bible addresses the same scenario with the concept of false gods, that we're drawing from the wrong energy field, but we think we're drawing from the right energy field. So again, coming back to where do I begin, where do I start, I would say that you start with skillful use of thought, knowing the difference between a need and a want, and then, of course, prioritizing your needs and elevating them to a position of importance that they warrant in your value system. Because here's the tricky part, and that is why they do address the concept of separation. Because we don't come in with the programming. We don't come in looking for spirit. We don't come in looking for God for validation. We come in and we look for food, we look for mother, we look for approval. And that's our original state of consciousness, is basically infantile defense mechanism. But then what we had to be taught, which typically came at your first point of passage, was how to separate from that and how to reconnect to a more reliable source of sustenance. And that's the part that I find is missing in our yoga communities, missing in our religious communities today, this connection. And then without having good leadership, without having people virtuous by nature in positions of authority, you don't have good examples. Coming back to sex out of marriage is immoral, without understanding, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just it doesn't have the same horsepower, it doesn't have the same return as sex with this inner union with the divine. The physical union taken without that is like the experience of the snowblower without gasoline. On the surface, it looks the same, but the one that has gasoline and starts up has a completely different degree of performance. And the same is true with the human being. It is this inner union with the divine that gives our practice power.
Regardless of where a person is in their daily routine or regimen, if they can become this carrier of Brahman that you speak of, then that enriches everything that they do. Would that be a correct assumption?
Well, yeah, because that becomes the benefit. That's what we try and talk about, taking yoga off the mat. When the force that is really important to you, this concept of prana, the life force, this tree of life, has been internalized in your body as a symbol for validation, a source of sustenance, then no matter where you are, you feel connected to something that's pure, powerful, and sacred. And of course, this inner union produces a change in the human being. When matter and mind now come together with this source of sustenance, we start to become something different. We start to become spirit. That's where the benefit, this concept of transformation, starts to reveal itself. When your sense of self transcends the limits of the body, and your identity starts to align with a part of yourself that is eternal, then the first thing that you start to see is that there is no fear. You have overcome one of your major obstacles. When your identity is all bound up in the body, that's all we really know is fear-based motivation. The other thing is the concept of avidya, ignorance, mistaking the impermanent for the permanent. Well, when you have this secret source of sustenance internalized in your physical body, then the panel's wired. And then, of course, the concept of laziness implies there is a limited resource of energy. when you are now running on prana and you had what we call your conversion, then the force that is always with you is now what's motivating you. It translates into this metamorphosis of our feeling state. Originally, we're emotional, we're excitable. Then we're ambitious. And then, of course, we're enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. And the origins of the word enthusiasm means with theos. You're in tandem with your divinity. And with this internal connection comes this expanded sense of awareness, which then becomes the antidote to selfishness. That it's not all about drawing in, you're actually giving out because you recognize the same soul that's animating me is animating you. And what I'm putting out is what I'm getting back. And I like myself. But then, like what you said, when the symbol that you use to validate yourself, when your peak experience feeling is assigned to the availability of the force that is supporting your life right now at this moment, then something magical is happening to us. But if you don't purify your body, which comes into your first niyama, then you can't get this subtle source of sustenance into your body. That's one of the things we're really very clear about is the physics of spirituality. Like attracts like, and two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. We come in with a pattern, we look for food, we look for mother, we look for approval, and as long as we draw from this limited source of sustenance, then our minds remain small, our feelings are reduced to insatiable cravings. We've got our back to this really important resource and we're having problems. Now, once you've prepared your body, you've separated from that limited source of sustenance, and you've reconnected to this more reliable source of sustenance, then you have yoga. But you have to purify your body in order to get it in. That's why in certain forms of Christianity that have sacraments, the baptism, the washing of the original sin, comes first before this Holy Communion. Now, of course, I agree with Ralph Waldo Emerson that the Church blew the whole thing with the concept of the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. There again, now you've got this tangible image that you're using to represent this invisible, intangible source of sustenance, but now you have an attachment to a symbol that will not give you the return that you're looking for. The communion should be with this life force, with this invisible, intangible source of sustenance. And again, that's why a lot of it fails, because we don't understand the physics of spirituality. And then the other part is we don't really know what it's going to look like when we're actually doing it. Any questions about any of that we've covered this morning, or concerns or curiosities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that was a wonderful wealth of information and knowledge. And I think it's important for our listeners to realize and understand, what you were saying is that we can enrich our lives just by preparing ourselves to receive this connection, this spirit, and how it will change our perception and our life. I think that's what people need and are looking for right now is what's the process to do that. So I think it's fantastic that you have this program that can get people to do that.
Yeah, a big part of what we do is the experience. We don't just talk spirituality. We walk the talk. There is tangibility to it. It's not just a lot of slick phrases. Yoga is the union of the individual with divine. It's just a lot of words. But when you translate it into this actual experience, then we become something different. And the benefits that come with this connection do start to reveal themselves almost immediately. Because one of the things we do talk about is we're all codependent. We all have needs. Mm-hmm. But the secret to life is to put God first. And every religion on this planet is instruction to do this if you understand how to interpret the word. But you have to understand there is an experience that is associated with it. The word to put God first, what is God? Because my original concept was God was this cosmic puppeteer, this invisible man in the sky, when in fact God is the force right now supporting my life. And that's where I found yoga to be very beneficial, because it took something that was invisible and intangible and it made it on some level tangible. And the way that it did it was with this concept of pranayama, the association between life-sustaining force number 1, thought, and life-sustaining force number 2, breath. And that could be something we could get into maybe in our next show.
Yeah, I think that would be a great topic for next week.
I think we have a couple of minutes left, so maybe sum up what we were saying here, just to get maybe people that are practicing yoga to maybe question what it is they're doing. Good way to troubleshoot it is breath my party. Am I reveling in the availability of my next breath, or am I longing for something more tangible? These are good ways. If you haven't purified your body, though, you can't get spirit in it. But what you can do is try and get this other branch in your other hand. Just start changing how you're thinking. Ask the rhetorical question that we begin everything that we do: what would matter if my next breath wasn't there waiting for me? Because we're all codependent. We all have needs. Our bodies need something that we can sink our teeth into to validate ourselves. And when we desire this void, this nothing, then we become something different. So should we maybe call it a morning?
I think that was a great show. And like I said earlier, I think that was some wonderful information and certainly gives us a lot to chew on for the next week until our next session. Well, I appreciate your coming on board, Swami Jayananda, and appreciate the listeners out there. And we hope everybody has a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Namaste.